You know, one of the courses I've enjoyed teaching over my long career here at Weber State University has been the history of Africa. I picked it up because no one else in the department seemed to want to teach it, and so I spent a couple of years really investigating deeply the history of this very, very amazing continent. And it's a difficult course to teach because it covers so much ground. But let me cover just a little piece of ground with you today relative to the continent of Africa that's, I think, very interesting and relates to our subject of the effect of disease. It wasn't until well into the 19th century that Europeans were able to penetrate into the heart of darkness, as Joseph Conrad called it in his famous novel, because it was a very insalubrious place, which is a two-bit word that means it just wasn't a healthy place for Europeans to go. Things like malaria, schistosomiasis, other endemic African diseases, very, very difficult on outsiders. And so when Europeans ventured into the interior of Africa, Sir Richard Burton, his famous their famous trip into the mountains of the moon, these guys were only able to do that because of the development, in the case of malaria, of quinine or quinine that would ameliorate the effects of malaria. But there's another interesting part of the African story that disease has influenced dramatically. And that is when we come to the question of the cattle complex. And there are a couple of parts of this that are quite interesting. In Africa, as Craig can tell you better than I can, there is a beast called the Tsetse Fly, and it's absolute disaster for domestic cattle. When it bites the cow becomes infected with a disease that kills the animal. As a result of that, where there are tsetse flies, there are not domesticated cattle. Now, this has a number of corners to it in the story. One of the corners is that when Europeans wanted to come into Africa with herds of cattle, as they did into the Great Plains of North America, for example, that wasn't possible because of the presence of the tsetse fly. Perhaps more interestingly, there were native African groups that developed what we call the cattle complex culture, in which domesticated cattle became the very core not only of the economy of these peoples, but also their religion, their whole way of life. You determined wealth based on the cattle you own. Marriage customs were based on cattle. So even Africans found many places in their own land, the great continent of Africa, where they could not go with their culture. As a consequence of this, the vast interior of the African continent where the tsetse fly thrived, these Africans had to skirt. There was a great migration of Africans we call the Bantu, who originated up in the Benue River Valley, just kind of to the east of present-day Nigeria. By their language, we can trace their movement around the Congo Basin into the highlands, the Great Lakes region, the Great Rift Valley, down the east side of Africa into southern Africa, where Europeans began to encounter Bantu speakers in the late 18th, early 19th century, the Zulu and those folks you may know about. But they could not penetrate the Congo. The other corner of the story is that when you think of Africa, you probably think of vast herds of wild beasts, the wildebeest, the elephants, the gazelles. I mean, all this dramatic fauna that we think about when we think about wild Africa. If domesticated cattle had come into that area, they couldn't because of the tsetse fly. Perhaps most of those great herds would have gone the way of the American bison, to be replaced by cattle.